Okay, so without further ado, let's move into our next session here. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jane Philpott, who will be speaking to us today about the advances of the Ontario Health Data Platform in advancing health research. Dr. Jane Philpott is the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences and Director of the School of Medicine at Queen's University, and she's the CEO of the Southeastern Ontario Academic Medical Organization. She is a medical doctor and former member of Parliament. Prior to politics, Jane spent the first decade of her medical career in Niger, West Africa, where she was a family doctor in Markham Stouffville for 17 years and became Chief of Family Medicine at Markham Stouffville Hospital in 2008. From 2015 to 2019, she served as Federal Minister of Health, Minister of Indigenous Services, President of the Treasury Board, and Minister of Digital Government. She currently serves as the Minister's Special Advisor for the Ontario Health Data Platform. Welcome, Dr. Philpott.
Thanks very much. I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you, Elise, for the lovely introduction, and good afternoon to everyone who's at the Clinical Trials Ontario Conference. It's a pleasure to be joining you. Of course, I wish I could see all your beautiful faces in person and know who's out there, but I am very happy to have an opportunity to be with you and look forward to the day when we can actually do these things, at least partially in person again. So I'm sure you've had a busy 3 days and you're probably exhausted if you've been following along all of the presentations, and it looks like you've had a terrific conference, and I hope you've learned lots of great things. The topic that I've been asked to speak about today is some of the new opportunities that have become available through the Ontario Health Data Platform, and especially as it relates to the work that many of you are interested in, research in general, and clinical trials in particular. And so I'm going to go through a number of themes here today, and all of them will have some relevance to this overall topic, starting a little bit more focused just specifically around health data and opportunities for collaboration, and we'll move a little bit more specifically into the Ontario Health Data Platform a little later in the talk. So I like to set this in context because I became involved and acquainted with the work of the Ontario Health Data Platform in the context of the pandemic and in the context of a period of time where I was thinking a lot about health data and how much more work we need to do so much better around our understanding, our aggregation of data, and our ability to be able to interpret it. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the beginning, and then give you a bit of an overview of where things are at with the OHDP. I expect some of you are somewhat familiar with it, perhaps a few of you very familiar with it, and others not at all. So I'll try to make it as broad as possible. And then in the latter part of the talk, just give you a sense of what I think is exciting about this and the thoughts about the new era that this brings us into, in terms of opportunities for clinical trials and certainly for health research more broadly. But let me start back to about a year ago when I was thinking a lot about health data in the context of the pandemic. And I think, you know, some of these reflections have been perhaps overdone, but we like to look at what's been good about the pandemic, what are the things that this terrible disruption has brought in the way of opportunity, and then also what has it exposed about the significant fault lines that exist in many spheres of our lives. So when it comes to the issue of health data, I think, you know, one of the things that people immediately jump to in terms of the disruptive opportunity of this terrible tragedy that none of us would ever have wished upon the planet, but in spite of it, we see that it has moved us forward in the area of virtual care is probably one of the obvious things that clinicians like myself will think about, and seeing how rapidly we were able to make the transition into that space. We've also just seen that the whole society is suddenly much more interested in health data, in epidemiology, and suddenly everybody's a mini expert in epidemiology, and we're seeing lots of really interesting applications for data visualization, for example. The launch of the health data platform, I think, would not have happened, and certainly would not have sped along as quickly as it has were it not for the context of the pandemic. And this fact that we've suddenly learned how to pivot and how to imagine that things are not so impossible as we once thought them to be. And it's allowed us to be able to start to think, well, what more could we do? What more is possible? But of course, the pandemic has also exposed all the things that we probably knew were not working so well in the health data world, but have become so much more serious for us. Certainly, when you look at the data around the pandemic, I think one of the things that it exposed is the fact that our public health legislation doesn't actually do what we need it to do for the benefit of working through a pandemic in a successful way, because we haven't got the legislation that enables that, because we haven't had the investments at multiple layers of society to be able to understand data and use it properly. And there just aren't all the right incentives in the system to be able to either oblige or encourage collaboration. You look in Ontario, for example, at multiple public health units who are each doing fantastic work, but often doing it in somewhat siloed conditions. Their ways of presenting data, their ways of interacting with one another are not necessarily consistent. And then, of course, if you look up into the broader picture at a national level, for example, we still don't have the right obligations for provinces, for example, to share their data in a standardized way at a national level. And so what that's led to is that we've certainly done better as the pandemic has evolved, but there still is this real gap of real-time standardized data. And what I've found really interesting is that people are filling in the gaps. People that are high school teachers that suddenly become the best epidemiologist available, and we're seeing the media often doing really great work around data visualization. Obviously, lots and lots of academics stepping into the fray and showing that our public institutions and governments often don't have the kind of information that they need, although one can certainly acknowledge that they have done a relatively good job at playing catch up. The thing that became really evident to me early in the spring, so I didn't start my work here at Queen's until July 1st, and I spent the spring, after I canceled all the travel that I had been planning to do in the spring, working at a COVID assessment center, and then helping at a very bad outbreak in a group home in the Markham area, and became really acutely aware of the front lines of what happens when we've got so much siloed data and our inability to be able to capture it. And I started to think about what happens when a single person moves through the system, and where all the data points could be captured in that journey of being a COVID patient, from the point in time when a person first starts to go online and self-assess, to when they might see their primary care provider or go to a COVID assessment center, get a lab test done, eventually interact with public health and other parts of the health system. And what you actually realize is that, and this is actually a simplified chart to kind of look at the way that data moves around and the silos that it exists in. And lots of pieces are missing from this chart, including vaccinations, which is another whole story in and of itself. But you look at how there are multiple databases throughout the system that are all part of the same person, and they generally don't speak to one another, or when they do speak to one another, they speak almost always in unidirectional ways, as opposed to multi-directional. And you're also seeing an enormous amount of data that's moving around in analog format, usually faxes or even sometimes on paper. And so as you follow the journey of someone through the system, it becomes incredibly difficult to actually get the decision support tools that you could imagine would be so helpful if you had a way to have a person moving through and knowing that their family doctor's electronic medical record was linked perfectly into the hospital medical record, was linked to the lab, and then linked to public health. And still, in parts of the province, we're seeing, lab tests being e-faxed to public health units who are re-entering all that data in separate databases that don't necessarily link back. So still a real jungle out there in the way that health data moves across the system. What could make a difference? Well, we heard an announcement last week that Ontario has finally decided to ban the fax in the public service in Ontario, which I think is a welcome move. Lots of people think that there are advantages to still moving health data by fax because of the perceived security advantages of it. But I would imagine most of you in the audience would agree with me that we should do away with faxes in health systems. Because it just makes it so much more difficult for us to be able to get the kind of data that we need, and hopefully that will come in the months ahead. But there are lots of other really simple things that I think we need to increasingly push toward. And I like to just, when I get a chance to rant a little bit about health data, I like to push for some of the really simple things that I think we need to all be advocating for. One, of course, being a single digital identifier for health. And you can imagine, those of you that are in the clinical trial space, just how much value this would add to be able to avail yourselves to long-term history of people and be able to follow them through a very long period of time, and increasingly finding ways that we have to get to a world where there is one patient and one health record. We're a long way from that right now. People have their health records in all kinds of different places, and so I share this with you just because I really believe at the end of the day, I'm a family doctor, and I really see the world from the point of view of patients and people, and how everyone would like to think that when they go into one part of the health system, that they don't have to repeat the tests, that they don't have to repeat the story, that they don't have to jump through enormous hoops to be able to get the rest of the health system to understand their medical history. So these are things that are all part of what was going through my mind in April of last year. And it was actually probably more like May or June that I got the call from the Minister of Health to ask if I would be interested in helping on the Ontario Health Data Platform. If some of you were listening for this story back in the spring, you may have heard of something called Panther. That was the original announcement that came out of the province, was that they were establishing a very large health database that would be available for research and also for policymakers. The name Panther eventually got dropped for a number of reasons, and it has since then been known by the charming name of the Ontario Health Data Platform, and now is happily settled in a website of its own. So what is the Ontario Health Data Platform? Well, it's intended for researchers and academic organizations and research institutes, but it is a platform that allows what will eventually be the largest collection of health data sets in the country to exist in a high performance computing environment that is going to be enabled by the kind of security and privacy protection that's necessary when you're talking about people's personal health information, but will allow for very advanced forms of computer processing, and has been initially put in place as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think increasingly there's lots of evidence and discussion around the fact that after all the work that's gone into it over the past year, hopefully it will be with us for some time to come and outlive the pandemic. So what are the goals of the platform? Well, one of the things I talked about earlier was just this issue of timeliness of research. And, obviously, any impactful and important research does ultimately lead to changes in the way that we do care and to changes in the way patients are treated and therefore their outcomes. But how can we actually speed up the breadth of what can be done in the research world, but also be able to get access to that information in a very timely way? And how do we take advantage of the fact that advanced computer technologies are rapidly changing everything about our lives, from how we shop online to the food choices that we make every single day. But how do we bring those technologies into a place where they can actually make that kind of difference in the world of health information? And how can we do it in a way that will be able to maintain public trust and maintain the very important measures that are necessary around privacy and security? And so what's evolved over the last year is this data platform. We describe it as a federated data platform where there are multiple data sources, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, are brought into these secure computing environments. And as I'm describing this, some of you will instantly say, well, that's what the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences does, and you're absolutely right. And so when the idea of the platform came up, it quickly became clear that this needed to be done very much in partnership with the ICES, to the point that the platform actually now exists in two sites in particular. One, which is the mature site of the ICES, and we affectionately call it the OHDPI. And the platform now also has an additional platform site, which happens to be located here at Queen's University, the Center for Advanced Computing. And so that portion of the platform is described as OHDPQ. And it's really been a very fascinating exercise in being able to see these two parts of the platform work together and be able to determine what that looks like and how we can make sure that people who are trusted researchers can have access in both of those locations. I ended up through this process in my role as special advisor to both the Minister of Health and to the President of the Treasury Board, chairing as well something called the JMR, which is not spelled out there on that slide, but the JMR is the Joint Ministers Roundtable. And so what the ministers did was to invite a large group of experts, some 40-some experts across the country who have expertise in not only health and academia, but lots of policy experts, computer experts, legal expertise, etc. And those people have been meeting on a monthly basis in order to look at the development of the OHDP and advise the government from a policy development perspective. And we've ended up then dividing that Joint Ministers Roundtable into a number of working groups, because these were the themes that arose very early on as to where the government would need some support and advice. One of them, of course, being around the fact that, again, we're talking about people's health data. This is something that is of great importance to make sure that there's civic engagement, public understanding and acceptance of how health data is being used, including, of course, the very live issues around equity considerations and both the risks and benefits of ensuring that race-based data is available. There was an extremely robust set of conversations that are still ongoing around the intellectual property policy that would need to accompany the development of the OHDP, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later on. We had another working group that was the data supply chain working group, really trying to be super responsive to researchers to say these are the kinds of data sets we'd like to be able to have. And the government, I think, is to be commended for having particularly tried to make sure that data was available to be able to answer some of the challenge questions that I'll refer to shortly. And then perhaps one of the most challenging pieces of all was just ensuring that we've got the right framework for data governance to go forward, the infrastructure that's necessary to be able to go forward with a platform which should really be world-class in the way that it gets developed, and therefore, of course, in the way that it gets is governed. So the earliest version of the Ontario Health Data Platform opened for business in July of last year, and there have been a number of early projects which have almost entirely taken place on the OHDPI portion of the environment, but other projects are being phased in and being prepared, including those that are being prepared to go onto the OHDPQ part of the platform. I encourage you, if you're interested in figuring out how to access this platform, to go to the website, which will give you what is, I think, a work in progress, but increasingly a better and better process for researchers who want to get on the platform, want to find out how that's done, and can submit a request to be part of that. The government felt early on that they wanted to focus on some priorities that would be really important to both government as well as other policy decision makers in the evolution of the pandemic. And so they ended up working through a number of research priorities, of course, with input from the Joint Ministers Roundtable and other experts to sort of say, these are some of the themes that we really want the platform to be able to focus on in the early days, because the enormous investments, of course, being made in response to the pandemic. And so these were certainly some of the things that have been prioritized by the government. But the data strategy includes the possibility, or has foreseen, and therefore continued to work toward the fact that the platform can be used for these challenge questions. There's certainly been lots of healthy response, dozens of projects that have focused in terms of responding to challenge questions that have been put out by policymakers in order to answer really important practical questions. But there has also been an option for people to bring their research projects to the platform and to be able to use it in that way. And then finally, what's potentially the most interesting sort of future use is the possibility of more free-ranging explorations of complex data, the sort of opportunity to play in the sandbox, as it were, when you get multiple big and interesting data sets that can be matched together in such a way that discoveries can take place that might not otherwise be necessary, without sort of allowing the machine learning and AI analytics that would be would potentially open up associations and information that wouldn't otherwise be available to us. And in its ultimate state, all of these things can be done on both the I and the Q portion of the platform. So what makes me excited or enthusiastic about the OHDP? And it's, I think it's been kind of a quietly humming along in a number of ways, but I think increasingly you're going to be hearing more about it, and people will become more and more enthusiastic, I think, about what it can offer to us and how it can actually be a competitive advantage for us here in Ontario. One of the things I would say, and I'll list a number of them, but one of them I think I feel quite positively about at this point is that it's had an iterative approach to governance. It's been much more complex than you might imagine on first glance to be able to figure out what this looks like. There are, of course, interesting corollaries in other provinces or in other countries where you see very large data platforms coming together. And I would have to admit that in the early days, I thought this can't actually happen inside of government. You look at the UK Biobank, for example, which is started off inside government and has ended up as a not-for-profit corporation, arm's length from government. And so we wondered, there was lots of discussion about what this would look like. But I would say that it would never have come as far as it has to date, unless it had been a government-sponsored research platform in its early days, just because of a number of pieces of regulatory work that had to be done, and those ability to be able to move relatively quickly for the kind of approvals that were necessary to get this going. But I again would commend the government for being really open to an iterative approach as to how all of this has been managed. And I think it's in a good place now, but probably not in its kind of end format of governance yet. And there's open acknowledgement and willingness to kind of imagine what the future might look like for the platform. The project management is currently being led by INDOC, and I think they have really even getting to that place and seeing how INDOC has been able to bring a number of partners together across the province has really demonstrated a commitment to continuous quality improvement in terms of what the platform looks like, and and what it can do and what it could be in the end. Of course, one of the big assets and opportunities is the high performance computing environment. I'm not a computer scientist in any stretch of the imagination, but by working so hard to be able to get all these data sets into the Center for Advanced Computing here in Kingston will allow researchers to be able to have the kind of computational muscle that's necessary to answer the really big questions and to be able to use those advanced computing technologies, which I think people are very excited about. And if you look at some of the really large data sets around the world and data authorities like FinData and others, I'm told by those who know more about the computer science part of this than I, that really this could potentially be world-class or best-in-class in terms of the opportunity to be able to use those kinds of technologies and to be able to match that up with the breadth of data that will be available. I think, again, one of the really great opportunities of this is that it really has been forced upon us, I say us, society, but it's been forced upon the government to really do this with the very highest standards for privacy and security. It's led to maybe a little bit of slowdown along the way because of enormous amount of privacy impact assessments that had to be done and threat risk assessments and looking at the cybersecurity associated with it, working very closely with the Information Privacy Commissioner in the province to just really make sure that this is as Loctite as it possibly can be, and we had. It had to be set with an extremely high bar, and I think that will provide significant reassurances to people that the public health, the personal health information is safe. One of the things that excites me the most is the data supply chain piece. And I would say, this is still a work in process, but I have been really impressed with the government's commitment to say, you want that data on the platform, we're going to keep working until we make it happen. So there's data that's already on the ICS portion of the platform, as well as the Q portion, including the typical administrative data sets that people are familiar with in terms of OHIP billing data, emergency use, hospital ins and outs, etc. The full set of lab information, the public health information systems. But the next cluster, which I think is going to start to make things really interesting, is the opportunities to start to bring in a little bit more complex data sets, including things like electronic medical records, which all family doctors know are amongst the most robust and rich pieces of data that are available. But to incorporate that into something like this would be really an enormous opportunity, and some smart people that are involved in some of those discussions, I think, are quite enthusiastic about it. The idea that researchers could bring their own data, consented data, to use and to interact that with the publicly available data sets is a great opportunity as well. And then, of course, the longer term hope is just hope and intention is to be able to bring the most complex pieces of data onto the platform as well, including diagnostic imaging and pathology data, as well as genomics and many other pieces of data sets that we really haven't had a public place for people to be able to do that kind of work and to be able to collate data from across the province. In terms of other things that I think are really exciting, and we're already starting to see, what that could look like, is the potential for that real-time evidence-informed decision support. So, as I said earlier, my focus is always from the clinical lens. What does it look like on the patient front? How are we going to actually be able to make decisions? I'm happy to say I haven't got the latest update, but that the COVAX Ontario data, immunization data, has, I believe, now been fully moved on, and the amount that exists onto the platform. And you can imagine having access to that vaccine data will allow that kind of very close to real-time information around, who gets which vaccine, who got, a mix and match vaccine, what are the outcomes looking like, what are the adverse effects like. So a great opportunity there. IP has been probably one of the hardest pieces of the whole project, but I think we've actually gotten to a really good place. Again, it's an iterative process, and has probably led to some frustration by some and still perhaps a little skepticism by others. But I actually think this is a really smart, modern approach to intellectual property policy that has been brought forward with the OHDP. The government has been very cognizant of its responsibility and its stewardship of intellectual property for a government-sponsored platform that has had the investment of public funds into it. And the desire is, of course, that investment is accounted for, and that there be ways that academics will not be held back from being able to use the IP for research and teaching and publication purposes, and that there will be avenues for additional purposes, including commercialization, but that it be done in a way that is appropriate from a stewardship point of view. And so you'll even see, I think, if those of you who followed the budget that came out yesterday, you'll see some really forward-looking commentary there around IP and the desire to work with the academic sector to look at how publicly supported research IP is mobilized for the benefit of Ontarians, and there is an IP action plan there. And then I guess the final thing just to say is that I've been really impressed in the process of rolling out the OHDP, how collaborative it has been. And even at the Joint Ministers Roundtable, we had a good space for open, respectful disagreement as to things like, data supply chain and IP policy and what does engagement look like. So I think that robust conversation has been really helpful to be able to say, how do we actually do the best in the world at bringing together this platform and making it available for public use, for researchers and academics, but ultimately as well for those of you who represent industry to be able to find pathways that, of course, there needs to be opportunity to see this as a tool for economic development and job creation. But how do we do that in a way that respects all of those other principles? So, I think it's led us to a place where people are thinking more about what do better partnerships look like? What do our partnerships for the future look like in a way that we all need to work together? The pandemic has taught us more than ever before how Canada's been a little behind the eight ball, perhaps one could say, and that we actually need to find a way to work together better. So with that, I think I've just about run out of time, and encourage us to realize that it's no longer the right thing to do to go it alone in the world of health research and clinical trials, that we will go a lot further when we go together, and we'll have a lot more healthy public benefit when we link up and do the hard work of what that looks like. So with that, I thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'll see if I've left any moments for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Philpott, for your presentation. And we do have just a couple moments here for questions. So I'm going to ask you one about big picture future thinking, which is, you spoke a lot about things like real-time evidence and better collaboration, data supply chain. How do you think our community can leverage this platform for the future of clinical trial design?
So, I think the sky's the limit as to what it could look like. I personally have a big interest in population health, and I think your audience could look at a platform like this to sort of say, all of the data that exists out there associated with clinical trials, how can we find better ways to kind of aggregate it, understand the health of a population better, and make even smarter choices about who should be potentially involved in clinical trials? How can we use a tool like this to be able to network together? Obviously, fantastic collaborations and networks already exist in terms of linking people together, but to be able to go to a platform like this, which will ultimately have massive amounts of data from across the province, to be able to make smarter choices about who's likely to benefit from a particular therapy, for example, and use that machine learning informed information to be able to design trials that are going to give us the best information possible.
Great, thank you. And I think I have time for probably one more here. So Dr. Fahad Razak previously spoke about the need to integrate research into clinical care. And from your perspective as the Dean of Faculty of Health Sciences at Queen's, and with your work with the platform as well, what is your perspective on the challenges and opportunities there?
Well, I didn't get to hear Dr. Razak's presentation, but I have no doubt that it was fantastic. I know the really terrific work that they've been doing on Gemini, for example, which I think has kind of opened up our minds to be able to imagine how we can use artificial intelligence to really allow that kind of real-time information at the patient's bedside. And even from the context, again, trying to bring it back to clinical trials, how can we use AI learnings to be able to develop trials that can actually take advantage of the learnings that could come from a platform like this, to be able to say that we know based on everybody else that's gone through this trial, who's likely to do well, who isn't likely to do well, and to be able to build in avenues to adapt and pivot along the way. So I think it really opens up an enormous, interesting, challenging new world, but one that's full of really terrific possibilities.
And you know what, I'm going to ask you one more, a little bit specific question, which is that at the beginning of this pandemic, one of the challenges that researchers have had is to be able to find and contact people who had a positive COVID test, but then weren't hospitalized. Is that the kind of thing that the platform could help with?
I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure that it's written exactly that way. I mean, it's not designed in that way. One could certainly study people who weren't, who were or weren't positive with COVID and sort of follow through their history through time. I'd have to think about how you could actually do that in a way that you could actually reach out to people specifically. But I have no doubt that some great designer could figure that out.
It sounds like it's an iterative process as we think about new things and learn new things to build on this platform. So thank you so much for joining us and describing it to us and filling us with new ways of thinking about how we can do this research. And